morning, everyone. Welcome to Briar Haus Writes. I'm Becky Parker, and today I am so honored to have Denton Loving with us. He is an amazing, acclaimed, award-winning author and speaker. So, Denton, welcome to our program.
Thank you for inviting me.
Denton, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I live around Cumberland Gap, Tennessee. I've lived here most of my life. I kind of grew up on the campus of Lincoln Memorial University. My mother was a librarian there. And I think even before took that position as a librarian, she always instilled a love for books in me. But growing up, I literally feel like I sort of grew up in the library and grew up on campus and eventually went to undergraduate school there and then later worked there for a lot of years. So I have a background in communications and fundraising. And besides that, I also grew up on a farm in this area of Cumberland Gap. And for people who don't know, Cumberland Gap is in eastern Tennessee. It's
Mhm.
exactly where Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia meet. So we call this the tri-state region, one of the many tri-state regions in the country. But um, I can be in Kentucky or Virginia in no time, and people often get confused because depending on where you're going, you have to cross Virginia for like literally 2 seconds to get into Kentucky or vice versa. So um, we're all part of the same community here. And I've lived here most of my life. I wasn't born in this area, but my dad's family has deep connections to
Mhm.
the area. And I now am fortunate that I get to spend a lot of time writing and teaching and traveling to do some of that teaching. And yeah.
But you could live anywhere in the country. So why do you choose Appalachia to be your home?
Well, it's my family has been here for so long. It's the place that I know best, and it's the place that I'm the most comfortable in in most ways. My parts of my dad's family have been in Kentucky since it's before it was a state. I think that's true about Tennessee also. They were very early settlers, and so even though I was not born here, it was really important for my dad to come back here, and and he wanted to raise me here.
Oh,
And so it's really in my blood, I guess.
yeah, your DNA.
I mean literally my DNA and also as I said, it's the place that I know and feel most comfortable. It's just home at this point. And I find a lot of inspiration to write about this place. A lot of my poems aren't very political so I'm not writing about the region in that sense,
Hmm.
but I do write a lot about landscape and about place and the people that I know and meet inform my work. So all of that's very important to me.
When did you finally decide, hey, this is what I would like to do is to be a writer or a poet? Was it always something that you did? I know you were spent a lot of time in the library, but what about writing?
You know, I ever since I was very young, like maybe 3 years old,
Mhm.
I had a list of things that I wanted to be. And one of them was always a writer. And I think that was because there were always books in my house. My parents always read to me. My parents read themselves. Books were, an importance was always placed on books and reading. And I knew from a very early point that my parents valued my ability to read. And so I respected writers and I had no concept of what was involved in actually putting a book together, but I just, would tell people, I want to be a writer when I grow up. And so I would write these little books, and I would type on my mom's typewriter and I would, create these little stories. And I was always thinking about writing a book. I just didn't really know actually how to do it, but that was always sort of in my mindset. I got really serious about it, I guess, a little over 16 or 17 years ago.
Hmm.
I took a writing class and I was an adult at that point. And so there were some things like how to actually finish a short story that were really difficult for me. Characters were great. Plot was not something that was my strength, but even when I had plot, I really struggled with how do I make it land? How do I make it end? How do I know where the ending is? And this class that I took was really helpful. And after that, I started going to writing workshops, a lot of regional workshops. I worked with other writers and authors. And eventually, Morris Manning was one of the people who suggested that I should think about going to get an MFA. And I don't think that it's necessary for all writers to have an MFA, but it was really good for me at the time. I had been working very hard on my
Mhm.
own for 4 or 5 years. And I was at a place where I didn't really know where to go next and what to do.
Right.
And so the MFA helped me a lot. I was really fortunate to be accepted into the program at Bennington College in Bennington, Vermont. It's a low residency program, so I would go there for 10 days at a time. I went there for five total residencies. And that way I could live at home. I kept my normal job. For 2 years, everything was centered around writing and the work for my MFA. And it was really, really helpful for me. And it really pushed me past some of the limitations that I had and made that. And it was after that that a while after that, but I knew that I wanted to be able to write full time.
Right.
And then about 9 years ago, my dad was really not well, and I knew he wasn't going to live very long. And I had sort of figured a way that I could not work for a little while so that I could take care of him.
Mhm.
And I kept thinking, then I'll have to go back and get a job. But if I'm lucky, like, maybe I can write a book while I'm also helping take care of him. And so I've been fortunate that now I find employment by teaching workshops and I work for a press. And so I can cobble together enough things that I don't have a full-time job the way that most people do or expect, but it works for me.
Well, and that time with your dad, that's worth any job. It's
Absolutely. I always tell people that I have no regrets about that it was the best decision I ever made.
Tell me about the hardest topics that you cover. You talk about landscapes and things like that. In your second book, the collection is called Tamp. Is that included in that list of hard topics that you write about?
Yeah, Tamp is really a lot about my dad. I mean, almost entirely about my dad. It's some of the poems were written during his last illness when, the last year or so when he was not very well. A
Hmm.
lot of the poems were written in the immediate kind of aftermath of his death, and some later on when I had a little bit more perspective. But I, I, I didn't think that's not what I was writing when I thought, oh, maybe I'll publish get a book written while I'm taking care of my dad. It's just that this was how I was processing my grief by writing these poems. And then I did a lot of work to try to make sure that they weren't sentimental that or overly sentimental, that they actually worked as poetry. And that's really, I think, one of the toughest things. A lot of people are writing about grief.
Right.
Poetry, I think, so often is the language of grief for
Mhm.
us writers and for some readers also. But there is something about the poetic mode that lends itself to being philosophical and, you know, tackling tough subjects, maybe from a slantwise angle.
Mhm.
You can also write about really joyful things in poetry. I don't ever want to insinuate that you can't do that too. But for me, it just poetry felt like the natural place for me to write about what I was going through with the loss of my dad. And that at some point I just realized that, oh, I actually have a lot of poems about my dad and about this subject. And I started thinking about it and I thought, oh, there's a book here.
Mhm.
And so that became Tamp. And that was really the hardest thing that I've probably ever written about. I mean, I think tough subjects come up all the time.
Right.
Maybe in a poem here, maybe there's a memory that comes out that we're sometimes not even expecting, and think, oh, that was a really hard thing, and it showed up in this poem or this story, whatever you write. but for me, this writing about my dad in this long period, this prolonged process really took a lot of time. That was probably the toughest thing.
Well, and I think I read where this book, Tamp, has actually won a very important award. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it actually just happened this week. I'm really grateful that it was selected for the Tennessee State Book Award for poetry. It's This is the first year that the state of Tennessee has awarded any such honors to books, and they recognize a poetry book, a book of fiction, and a book of nonfiction this year. And I'm really grateful that Tamp was the one selected. So, yeah, that news just came out this week. Thank you.
Well, I wish you all the best for that because grief is one of those things that it's not just a one-time event, and people process it, and it can go on for years and years until eternity. Um,
Absolutely. We carry that with us. And the nicest, the two nicest things about this book for me have been that it's allowed me to carry my dad with me in an additional way than we normally carry our loved ones, because I've been allowed to talk about him and to tell people who didn't know him about him.
mhm.
And so that's been wonderful to feel that he is still with me in that sense. The other way is how many people have come to me because they've read this book and they said that they've connected with it because of their own grief for some reason. And so the award is incredibly nice, and it feels really validating. What I hope that when anytime that something like this happens for a book, what you hope is that it paves the way to get the book into more readers' hands, and that, maybe other people will feel that connection too.
Kind of a legacy for your dad.
Absolutely.
More
Absolutely.
more
Yeah.
important than the award, but the award is nice because it when people hear about that, they're going to want to read that, and then the more connections you make.
Yes.
Tell me about I think one of the things that I find very fascinating about you, Denton, is that not only do you lead workshops and you do all of the teachings, but you also edit several publications. How did it come about that you could be an editor?
Well, when I was still working at Lincoln Memorial University, I worked very closely with the writer in residence at the time, Darnell Arnault. And she and I had this idea to create a literary magazine for the university. The university had a very small, not regularly published student publication that featured only the work of university undergraduates, which was incredibly valuable for them. But we thought, this school should have an actual national literary journal that allowed other people to submit work and would be a way to help people know about the university.
Mhm.
And because Lincoln Memorial has a really interesting history and legacy within Appalachia, and we thought this is a great way to extend that. And so we started that magazine called Draft Horse, and the theme of it was about work. And we did that for several years, and stopped doing it about the time that I left my full-time job.
Mhm.
Uh, and and then a few years ago during the pandemic, some friends that I had gone to my MFA program with at Bennington were talking, and we had always talked, I guess, about the possibility of creating our own journal, but the
Mhm.
timing was never right. It's a lot of work, and we, said, yeah, that would be really cool to do one day. And then we found ourselves about, I don't know, 10 or 12 months into the pandemic, and we said, it kind of feels like if we're going to do this, this is the
Do it
time to
now.
do it. And we're scattered all across the country. There are four of us. One of my co-editors, co-publishers is in North Carolina, one in Iowa, and one in Massachusetts, and I'm here in Tennessee.
Wow.
But we're lucky we meet every week through Zoom, and we're in constant contact with each other. And we see each other usually at least once a year in person, but we can do everything online. And we have other people that we work with that are able to help us with like design and layout and promotion, those sorts of things. But yeah, it's been a really great experience. And I think that when Darnell and I started Draft Horse, one of the reasons I wanted to do it was for the experience.
Hmm.
I was really interested in how literary magazines worked. And I wanted to understand because I was submitting my work to magazines. I wanted to know more about how it actually happened.
Right.
Um, and I found that it, being an editor or learning how to edit other people's work is hugely beneficial for your own writing because you can, when you see mistakes, or not really mistakes, but just when you see why things aren't working in somebody else's poem or story, then
Hmm.
it helps you understand your own work better and how to shape it and how to recognize those things that aren't working for yourself. So that was a really wonderful experience to edit Draft Horse. And I think that experience was invaluable as I helped create Cutleaf with my new co-editors. Um, I don't think any of them had ever worked on a regular literary journal. I know one of my co-editors had been a guest editor at
Hmm.
different times for different projects, but I think that I was able to just to feel like, oh, I've done this before. This is easy, like I know how to do this because I've done it, and so it's been a really great opportunity, and it's really wonderful to help somebody bring their work into the public and to publish it. And I know what it's like, especially when I was first starting out, to have something published and to the feeling of like, oh wow, I really did this. And then to make that happen for other writers, I think is really special.
But what if you get a piece and you go, oh my gosh, look at this. This is horrible. How do you gently break that to the person that, you know, maybe they need to go in a different direction? And I
Yeah,
can say this as a person who's received several letters of go in a
yeah,
different direction.
sure. I mean, I have so many hundreds of rejection letters. I had like lost count many years ago. Um, the I guess one of the positive things or the lucky things as for an editor is one of the unfortunate things for the writer is that if something's really terrible, the editor doesn't have to say, this is just awful. You just like, just start over. Just don't do this. You get so, you can, we, we all, everybody in the literary journal business relies on form letter that really just says thank you very much, but we're not able to publish this. Um, that is sometimes that sometimes probably feels like a disservice to the writer. But I will also say that as an editor, we are all overwhelmed with huge numbers of submissions. And
Right.
so when people say on their um, guidelines that they don't have the time or manpower or ability to send individual comments,
Hmm.
they really mean it. We all really mean it. Like, I think last year for Cutleaf, I read about 1,700 poems for our open submission period. And so you just can't
You're
respond to
inundated.
every single one. But there is also something really nice about when you find a poem or a story, an essay that has so much potential, but isn't quite working yet.
Hmm.
And sometimes you have the ability to work with the writer and say, we really, really love this. It's not working. Here, are you open to some suggestions? Here's what we think you should try. And, and the writer is often usually really grateful. Not always. Some people are very stuck and say, no, this is the essay.
Hmm.
And I respect that. But a lot of times we're also glad for somebody to actually turn an editorial eye and give us guidance, right?
Hmm.
Um, but but also there have been opportunities that I really love, and it kind of feels a little fraught because you never know how the writer will take it. But sometimes, even if you're not going to accept a piece, you have the ability where you can see exactly what's wrong with the piece or what it needs, and you can maybe offer that suggestion. And that's often feels really nice, especially when the writer comes back and says, you know, I'm sorry you didn't take the piece, but thank you. This is really helpful. Like,
Right.
and sometimes they send the piece back and you say, like, yeah, this works great. Sometimes you see the piece somewhere else in another magazine and you think, yeah, oh, that works now. Good for them.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a win-win though, if they're open to criticism,
Absolutely.
constructive criticism. Denton, I wanted to ask you, um, you often are asked to speak at conferences and events. Why are workshops important for writers?
Well, there are so many wonderful conferences and festivals and workshops that are available, a lot of them at low cost. Sometimes there are ones that are free. They're available for people, for writers at all levels. And even some of the workshops that are maybe on the higher end are still a lot more affordable than going to get an MFA degree. And so you have this wonderful opportunity to work with editors and writers, people who understand the publishing business, people who have published, multitudes of books,
Mhm.
who can give you their impression, who will often the way many of these programs work is that there's a component where a writer will closely read your work and say, this is what you need to do. This is where you need to go. Not all of them have that component of critiques. Some of them are just show up and we'll write together and we'll see what happens. But I mentioned earlier that going to these workshops was one of the things that happened after the first class that I had
Mhm.
taken. And so I learned so much from the teachers that I worked with. I also can't say how enough about how invaluable it is to know other writers
Mhm.
and to meet other writers who are working at your level and above your level. And so my first workshop group was formed out of friendships that I made at a writing conference. We don't meet as often as we used um, to critique work because our lives have all sort of moved in different directions, but we're very good friends still.
Mhm.
And we're in contact with each other regularly. But I have seen so many writing groups start from people who meet each other at conferences. And I actually, every time I have the opportunity, if I'm speaking or just, randomly talking to people who ask me, what do I do? I always say, meet people, find there's somebody at this workshop who is who's going to be a good reader for you and who you can exchange work with, and they're looking for someone to exchange work with too. And your goal every time you go to one of these conferences or workshops is to find somebody that you can exchange work with. So I can't say enough about how important that community is, that sense of friendship, because writing is often really lonely. We're sitting most of the time in our study or our bedroom or our kitchen or wherever, a coffee shop, wherever we are, and we're in our head. We're just
Mhm.
like trying to get the words on the paper in the right order. And it can be very lonely sometimes. So it really helps when you have people that you can trust, that you can send your work to, and that you can just talk about, hey, did you write today? No, I had a really hard time. And maybe the person says that's okay, like don't beat yourself up about it, just let's try to write tomorrow. And that's just invaluable.
When you do, talk to your friends and you say, "Did you write today?" and they said no, what encouragement do you give them to begin that writing process again?
Well, it's I think about it a lot of the way people talk about diets. Did you mess up today? Yeah, I ate a huge piece of birthday cake. That's okay, like tomorrow's another day. We start back tomorrow. um I I think that also it's really helpful when you have friends who are writers
Mhm.
who will be interested and care about what is the problem, why why did you not write? And sometimes we're just busy, and sometimes there's something weighing on us that's blocking us or keeping us from moving forward. Sometimes we're just overwhelmed, and we're like, oh, I've got so many projects, I don't know what to do, and I'm stuck on this problem. And you can maybe talk about what's going on with the your whatever you're working on with another writer who may understand it better than somebody in your family or some other friend, who can say, you know, oh, you're having trouble with the story. You're stuck at this place. Have you thought about adding another character? Like, what happens if somebody else comes in and create and like, causes a problem? And some of these things can be so simple, and you would think, well, we should all know these. Let's
Right.
just keep a little running list that we can check off when we're
Mhm.
stuck. But it helps so much when somebody listens to you and can talk a problem out with you.
Do you ever recommend to them to try a different type of genre to write?
It's not something that I often uh, encourage other people to do. I feel like most of the people that I know are pretty entrenched in
Oh.
whatever genre they're writing,
Mm-hmm.
or even if they write multiple genres, they what if they're working on a piece in particular, then they have come to it thinking that no, this is a poem. Obviously this is a poem. Sometimes when I do realize, and other people have realized for me, is that they'll look at something and they'll maybe will say, this feels really complicated and really like there's more to say here. Maybe this isn't a poem. Maybe this is either an essay or a story. Have you thought about that? And and then, you know, and often, yeah, there is resistance because and I'll say that for myself too. I often feel resistant when someone says that to me because I think, no, I've already got this on the page. It's what it is,
Right.
right?
I've spent all
And
this
then
time on it.
maybe, right, and then maybe a little while later, I think it is something different. Okay, I have to, sort of start over. But yeah, I think that's the biggest thing about resistance. It takes so much to get us to where we have something on the page to show somebody that
Mm-hmm.
by the time, like, if we've gotten that far, then it feels really hard to just start all over.
Well, and someone once said that because they were getting quite a bit of success in writing poetry and short stories, but they weren't getting any success in what they really wanted to do, which was to write children's stories. And
Oh.
so their partner said, "Well, you know what? Look at what you're getting success in. Maybe you need to lean toward that area. Maybe that really is your gift." Um, but that didn't.
I think that's always something to consider. I feel like almost every writer I know thinks, oh yeah, I do this, but oh, also love to be able to do that. Like prose writers want to write poems, poetry, poets want to write prose.
Hmm.
It's just the way it is often. And I think it's good to push ourselves, but it's also really good to say, this is where the energy is. This is what's working. Let's not abandon the other things that we want to do.
Denton, we're talking about how some poems merge into other genres. Can you elaborate more about that?
Yeah, I was just thinking about how one of the things that I've often seen when I am reading poems, especially if I'm reading for the magazine or for any time that I've read for other journals or publishers, that I often see that a poem really wants to be an essay. And it could be a flash essay, which is about the same size as a poem or can be, but it could also maybe it's also calling for a little more information. Like, so maybe it wants you to extend it. But the poem is already so often very, very personal. Of course, not every poem is first person, but a lot of people write first person poetry.
Right.
Most poems come out of personal experience, I find. And so I think that there's this deep connection between that kind of first person poem and a first person essay. In both of those modes, we're trying to tell somebody about our lives and our feelings, right?
Hmm.
And so I think that I see a lot of poems that I think this does not work like a poem. It doesn't sound or feel like a poem, but it's interesting And if it were not formatted maybe in this way that doesn't work, and if it maybe had a little more information, and maybe if the writer wasn't thinking about how to make it a poem, if they just told this thing, then it would work. I think one thing that happens is that sometimes we place this higher value on the idea of something being a poem. And sometimes we don't value the essay as much, especially flash essay. Flash essay is really new to a lot of people still, I think. And so I just think I often want to tell people who submit stuff like, abandon this idea that it has to be a poem. Just write your story and tell what this is, and it'll work. It's all there. It's not working yet, but it's going to.
Tell me about Denton when you are not doing all of your writing and you're not doing your teaching and all those different things. What are your hobbies and your interests?
I always get a little stuck thinking about this question. I don't know how many hobbies I actually have. I just enjoy reading just for pleasure. I just love to read things that I don't have to read, like, when I'm not considering submissions.
Hmm.
I'm really interested in history. I'm interested. I love to watch um, movies and television shows that have a historical angle to them because I'm really interested in thinking about the ways that people lived in different times. And I'm interested in genealogy and DNA to a certain degree. Um, and I touch on that a little bit in my book Tamp, but I think that corresponds with the ideas of why I'm drawn to historical medium like television or film, because I am always thinking about where we come from and how I feel like there are these echoes throughout history. If you look and you think about the way, for me, for example, I think about my family that is alive now, and my parents and my grandparents and things that I've learned about my family in that time period. And then I discover something that maybe happened 100 or 200 years ago. And I see these interesting connections. And can I say for sure, like, oh, well, look how this keeps happening, or look at this. This is obviously why this thing from 200 years ago
Right.
affected this. I'm not necessarily saying that, but I'm interested in looking at that and thinking about how all that works. I also, as I said, I live on a farm. I don't raise any livestock there myself anymore. There are other people do raise livestock, but I'm still always busy taking care of the property. I mow a lot of grass, try to take care of the flowers. We have an aging orchard, which is something that I talk about in Tamp, and so there's always something, a tree needs to be trimmed, or something always has to be done, and so that keeps me busy.
No goats? No little
No
piggies?
goats.
What?
No.
How do you call it a farm? I used to live on a farm, so that's why I'm asking. Denton, would you like to read some of your work for us today? We would love to hear it.
Sure. Thank you very much. Yeah, I talked a little bit about how my book Tamp is a lot about my dad,
Hmm.
and a lot of it is centers around my dad's illness and then his death and my grieving process. So, another thing that I should say about a lot of my work is that I rely on sort of investigating my dreams a lot, because I always tell people if it weren't for my dreams, I wouldn't have anything interesting at all to talk about. But so dreams are important to the book and to me as well. And I'll read one of the early poems from Tamp, which begins in that mode. And the poem is called Another River of the Underworld. In my dreams, I walk the banks of an ancient, unnamed river surrounding the island of my dead. My heart is a boat with leaking ribs, beached on the river's far shore, long abandoned by the ferryman. I stand on the opposite side of the water and try to recall the four chambers of the ship in the distance. I can only name two: love and regret. So much else remains obscure, but this I know: sleep is another kind of prayer. Um, So I mentioned that place is very important, and particularly the farm where I live, which was very important to my dad, I write about. And so this poem is called There is a Barn, and it's um, the mode or the type. This poem was inspired a lot by a poem by Jennifer Stewart Miller, who's a wonderful poet that I admire a lot. This is a barn. There is a barn in this poem, built by men a century ago. No one alive remembers exactly, but someone cut the oaks and sawed the planks, nailed tin sheets to shape the roof. This barn sits by a creek. Some springs, the creek overflows and the barn floods. There is a hayloft in this barn, and many poles between the rafters where tobacco once hung to cure. Gaps between the boards let fresh air enter. Below the loft, the barn is divided into stables. Horse tack still hangs in some, though no one alive remembers those horses. Out of hard labor, calves have been born here and died. So too wound locked mothers. In the last stall, a man I knew stacked square hay bales as tight as mice, though the hay was thick with thistles. Following fall, the cattle were sold, the pastures left fallow. The man died and the hay moldered. Did I mention this barn is black? Its roof, too. The man who packed the hay picked the paint, though there were red barns in his history. Perhaps the barn's color doesn't matter except to me because that man was my father. God alone knows if it makes any difference. The hay was wasted by all but the mice, always burrowing through the past.
It's beautiful.
And thank you. And I'll read one more um, that also mentions a barn. This is very true that after my dad died, I kept finding pairs of his gloves, or not necessarily a pair, but maybe one of his gloves. So this is called If There's an Angel of Lost Gloves. If there's an angel of lost gloves, my father didn't believe and didn't wait for holy intercession. He mislaid his gloves faster than his temper. He wasn't careless, though I never knew him to lay hands on the tool he needed when he needed it. So he bought pair after pair, suede cowhide fit to stretch barbed wire. Still, he usually worked with only one hand sheathed, and sometimes then with the fingers blown out, each digit ruptured by the snag of steel points reaching next to rip open skin. Now I find his leather fingers cupping air like wren nest, lingering in buckets, on shed shelves, on the aged oak floor of the barn loft, in the midst of a task, maybe a pair of nails within reach, as if he'll return when he finds his hammer.
How do you think your dad would have responded to your books, to your book?
Um, I think he would be shocked and very pleased at the reception that this book has received, and he would be really touched and honored that I wrote these poems for and about him. Um, I think that it would make him very happy. I don't know exactly. I sometimes think I don't, when I always think of him when moments like when I won the Tennessee Book of the Year award. I wish that I could tell him that, but I think he'd be very pleased.
Was your dad a demonstrative man? What was his personality like?
Yeah, he was always demonstrative with me. He was very people really respected his opinion. People loved my dad. My friends used to always all of my friends growing up used to always come to my house because they loved my parents and especially my dad. Um, So I used to sometimes think like I think they like my parents better than they like me, but my dad just treated everybody respectfully and sort of on the on his level. He was not impressed with people who thought that they were better, and he did not look down at other people. He was very conscious of trying to be thoughtful about people who needed help, people who were not in the best of circumstances. And he was a great father. He was, we were very much alike in many ways, so we didn't always get along. I mean, we sometimes butted heads with each other. But we always were very close.
It sounds like he was quite a character, and
He
maybe
was
you
he was definitely.
sounds like maybe you might be a little bit of one yourself, especially with those dreams, Denton. Come on
Yeah,
now, that would be a great way to open up a party. Like, hey, let me tell you, I dreamed about you last
absolutely. Yeah.
night. Denton, tell us where we can find your work. And you have a
Well,
website.
I have a website. It's just dentonloving.com. And I have two books that I published. My first book is Crimes Against Birds, and it was published by Main Street Rag. It's still available from them. My
Mhm.
second book, Tamp, is by Mercer University Press, and you can buy it directly from the press or anywhere that you want to online, including Amazon or bookshop.org, any of those places. And I also have work that you can find in journals and different places online. And if you're interested, you can go to my website and I have a list of publications, a lot of online publications that'll make it easy for you to see different pieces.
Denton, thank you so much for spending time with us today at Briar Haus Writes. We appreciate all that you do for the
I'm so
literary
glad to
world.
be here and I appreciate you inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you.